There are moments when authority reveals its true face. It does so not through laws or justice, but through the callous oppression displayed with absolute self-assurance. These moments arise when a badge becomes a license rather than a symbol of responsibility, when power regards obedience as a right, and when two police officers decide that a black woman sitting alone will cause trouble simply because she is in their jurisdiction. As the Friday lunchtime crowd began to thin out, the afternoon sun streamed through the high windows of Harbor Cafe. Renee Lawson pulled the sleeves of her gray hooded sweatshirt over her hands and settled into a corner table where the shadows cast by the beams above her head provided the privacy she desperately needed. Renee wasn't bothering anyone or causing a disturbance. She was simply sitting there, quietly and peacefully, out of sight. 14 hours. That was exactly how long she had spent in her office reviewing the files of misconduct complaints. 17 cases of excessive force, 9 allegations of racial profiling, 23 instances of false reporting. Each file represented a person crushed under the weight of an institutional mechanism designed to hold officers accountable while protecting the badge at all costs. As the chief of internal affairs for the city police department, Renee knew the system's ugliest truths. She had built her career fighting corruption from within, earning a reputation that was both respected and isolated. While the command staff appreciated her meticulousness, they resented the accountability she demanded. The patrol officers looked at her with suspicion bordering on hostility, and after documenting their failures non-stop for 14 hours, she needed this moment of invisibility. Renee was fully aware of everything. She was fully aware of the attitude toward her, smiling to her face while talking behind her back. She simply carried on with her life, focused solely on her work. She turned a blind eye to what was happening. "What would you like?" asked Tessa Ward, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached Renee's table with her usual smile. "Just a coffee, please." "Black," Renee said, keeping her voice low to blend in with the quiet chatter around her. Renee always adapted to her surroundings wherever she was, and did her best to ensure others weren't disturbed. The waitress nodded and returned with a steaming cup. Renee wrapped her fingers around the cup, letting the heat warm her hands. The cafe's atmosphere was relaxed, ordinary. After spending hours reading victim statements and reviewing body camera footage that corroborated every claim, knowing that half the cases would be dismissed due to technical details, it was exactly what she needed. The usual Friday crowd had filled most of the tables, people working on their laptops, friends chatting over lunch, regulars who knew each other's stories. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unburdened by the knowledge of how often the system they trusted let down the very people it was meant to protect. Renee was different from these people. Renee took a slow sip and let the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. The front door swung open with such force it rattled the windows. 2 uniformed officers burst in. Their loud voices drowned out the soft jazz music playing over the cafe's speakers. Officer Wade Brener led the way. As he surveyed the room as if he owned it, his badge reflected the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Officer Cole Fitch followed behind. With the eagerness of someone still learning to wield authority, he mimicked Brener's confident stride. A strange feeling suddenly welled up inside Renee. It was as if she sensed something was about to happen. Renee didn't take her eyes off her coffee, but thanks to years of training, she was acutely aware of their movements. She felt their attention lock onto her immediately. The only black woman in the cafe, sitting alone, her face partially hidden by her hooded sweatshirt. To them, she was an anomaly to be investigated, a problem to be solved, a target that had appeared on its own. Having experienced this before, she knew what was coming. As the officer's boots scraped across the wooden floor, Renee's spine tensed, their conversation cut off mid-sentence as they redirected their path straight toward her. "Well, let's see what we've got here," he said. Brener's voice, raised to draw attention, echoed throughout the cafe. "Someone who looks lost and alone," he continued. Fitch chuckled. "Yeah, this isn't exactly your usual neighborhood spot, is it?" he asked sarcastically. It was clear from the tone of his voice that he was looking down on her. The surrounding chatter died down. Customers lifted their heads from their laptops and sandwiches, then immediately looked away, a universal instinct to avoid getting involved when the police directed their attention at someone. No one wanted to deal with the police or get into any kind of trouble. Renee took another careful sip, keeping her movements measured. "I'm just quietly drinking my coffee, officers," she replied calmly but firmly. "Quietly drinking coffee?" he asked. Renee leaned against the table, coming within a very close distance of her personal space. "Alone? That's a bit suspicious, don't you think, Fitch?" he asked his partner. He was counting on his support, but there were some facts they didn't know. And those facts were going to get them into serious trouble. "It's definitely suspicious," Fitch agreed, moving in a coordinated motion to the other side, pinning him against the corner. "This place has standards, you know. We have to make sure everyone here belongs," he said. Everything was clear in both officers' eyes. Behind the counter, Tessa Ward cast uncertain glances between the two. Her previous easy smile had been replaced by visible unease. She grabbed a cloth and began wiping the far end of the counter. She'd chosen the safety of distance over intervening. Like the other customers, Tessa didn't want any trouble with the police officers. "I don't want to cause any trouble," said Renee, using the same calm tone she employed to diffuse tense situations. "I'm just going to finish my coffee and go home." If she'd wanted to, Renee could have ended the entire conversation right there. But she was curious to see how far both officers would go. There was a nasty edge to Brenner's laugh. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble? We're just being friendly, doing our job, making sure everyone's safe," he said. But he dragged out the word safe as if it were a threat. Renee was now certain something was about to happen. "Where are you from?" Fitch asked, his eyes scanning her hooded sweatshirt and jeans with a clearly judgmental gaze. "I don't think I've seen you around here before," he added. "From work," Renee replied simply. She could feel her pulse racing in her throat, but she kept her face neutral. Years of professional training were suppressing the anger building in her chest. She knew she had to stay calm. She'd been through this countless times before. "Is that so? Where?" Brener asked, moving even closer. "Because this is our patrol area, and we know the regulars here. Right, Fitch?" he asked his partner. "Of course, every single one of them," Fitch replied. Renee took another sip to buy herself time to assess the situation. She recognized this scenario immediately. She'd seen it documented in hundreds of complaint files. The aggressive posture, the coordinated questioning, the veiled threats disguised as false friendliness. Bad cops behaved this way when they thought no one important was watching. "I appreciate your commitment to the neighborhood, officers," she said carefully. "But I'd prefer to drink my coffee in peace," she replied firmly. "Peace?" Brener's voice hardened. "Are you trying to tell us how to do our jobs? Because you seem to be causing a bit of a disturbance?" he asked sharply. The atmosphere was growing increasingly aggressive. The threat hung in the air, clear to anyone who could hear it. A few customers gathered their laptops and bags, leaving their money on the tables as they slipped toward the door. Renee watched their faces. Witnesses, just as she'd seen countless times in her investigations, were choosing safety over getting involved in the incident. This was a perfectly normal situation. People didn't want to step outside their comfort zones. The slightest contact meant trouble for them. "There's no disorder here," Renee said quietly. "I'm just someone having a post-work coffee," she replied. "See, that's the problem," said Fitch, drawing courage from Brener's lead and continuing to speak. "You keep saying work, but you don't say where. People wonder what you're hiding," he said. Brener nodded. He was starting to enjoy his role. "I might need to see your ID," he warned, "just to make sure everything's in order." "I have ID," Renee replied, "but I'd like to know the exact reason you're asking for it." Her intention wasn't curiosity. She just wanted to make sure those officers weren't discriminating against people based on the color of their skin. "The reason?" Brener's laugh rang out sharply. "The reason is, I said so. Is that enough for you?" he said. Renee was now absolutely certain of one thing. Both officers were discriminating against certain people. That was the situation for Renee. Moreover, they were mocking and belittling her with ease. Tessa had stepped back and was standing nearby, tense. "Officers, she hasn't caused any trouble," she said. She did something she normally wouldn't have done, and spoke up. "Did anyone ask you?" Brener snapped, unsettling Tessa. Though Tessa was nervous, she wanted to intervene. Renee felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "There's no need for that tone," she replied. "What tone is unnecessary?" Fitch stepped closer, invading her space with deliberate aggression. "It seems you have a serious attitude problem," he added. "Maybe we should step outside," Brener suggested, his hand resting meaningfully on his belt near his service weapon. "Let's have a proper conversation about respect," he said. Their intentions were now clearly evident. Renee could foresee what might happen. She was trying to stay calm, but a storm was raging inside her. She had reviewed far too many cases similar to this one. She wanted to keep the situation under control calmly, but she also wondered just how far the officers might go. The remaining customers were now staring openly. Though no one dared to record openly, they had secretly raised their phones. Renee felt the familiar weight of loneliness settle on her shoulders. She realized she was alone against an authority that believed it had the right to abuse its power. She knew that those present couldn't help her immediately. Have you ever felt this kind of loneliness in your life? Or have you experienced something similar? Renee had seen this countless times in complaint files. She had read victim statements that described exactly this feeling. She had watched body camera footage of officers creating situations where any reaction served as a pretext for the incident to escalate. But reading about it and experiencing it were entirely different things. Now she was painfully experiencing what she had read. Brener grabbed an empty chair from a nearby table and dragged it across the floor, deliberately making a screeching noise that startled a few customers. He placed the chair right next to the table where Renee was sitting, blocking her path to the door. The message was clear. She couldn't go anywhere until they let her. They were trying to assert their authority by using their power, but there was one thing they still didn't know. That was who Renee really was. They were about to make the mistake of their lives. "All right," said the man, sitting down in the chair with exaggerated patience. "Let's start from the beginning. Who are you, and exactly what brought you to our neighborhood today?" he asked. The sharp, unpleasant scent of his cologne filled the space between them. He leaned forward, resting one elbow on the table while lightly tapping the guns at his belt with his other hand. He was showing off the weapons he held. He was trying to assert dominance. His goal was to scare Renee and intimidate her into doing what he wanted. "Come on," he continued, a feigned concern in his voice. "We're just trying to keep everyone safe. That's what good cops do, right?" he said. Fitch moved closer to Renee's other side. As the sleeve of his uniform reached past her to adjust the napkin dispenser on the table, it deliberately brushed against Renee's arm. When Renee instinctively pulled back, the man's smirk deepened. "You're pretty skittish, aren't you?" he asked. "I'd appreciate it if you'd give me a little personal space, officers," she said. Renee kept her tone measured and professional. It was the same tone she'd used in countless critical situations where she knew that diffusing tension was the only path to safety. She was aware that the slightest sudden movement or anything the officers found objectionable would prompt them to act immediately. A few tables away, a middle-aged couple exchanged nervous glances before gathering their belongings. The woman caught Renee's eye for a moment, then quickly looked away as she hurried toward the door. Another group of witnesses who didn't want to get involved. "How touchy," Brener chuckled, moving closer despite himself. "That's not very friendly. We're just doing our job, having a chat," he said. But both sides knew this wasn't a friendly chat. "Unless you have something to hide, of course," Fitch added. "No one's hiding anything," Renee said. "I'm just drinking my coffee and want to be left alone," she said. "You know what would clear this up quickly?" he asked. Fitch's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "An ID. Just as a precaution, standard procedure when someone looks like they don't belong here," he said. This was never a standard procedure. The implied meaning hung heavily in the air. "Not from around here." A code meaning not white, not welcome, not belonging in this cafe in this neighborhood. Renee felt a familiar surge of anger in her chest, but she suppressed it using the self-control she'd honed over years of work. "I haven't broken any laws or given you a reasonable cause. There's no requirement for me to show ID," she replied firmly. "See? Is that it?" Brener's smile faded slightly. "That's the kind of attitude that causes problems. We're trying to be reasonable here, but you're making things difficult," he said. In reality, they were the ones making things difficult. But they were so used to seeing themselves as in the right in situations like this that it seemed perfectly normal to them. "There's nothing difficult about this," Renee replied calmly. "I'm exercising my right peacefully," she said. "Rights?" Fitch sneered. "People like you always think you know everything about rights. You're always trying to make up excuses to avoid basic cooperation," he replied. The tension in the room was starting to rise sharply. The others still present were aware of the situation. "People like me?" she said. Renee turned slightly and met his gaze directly. "What exactly do you mean by that, Officer Fitch?" she asked. Her aim was to get him to say something about her skin color. That way, she could prove he was being discriminatory. Fitch hesitated for a moment, then regained his mocking smile. "You know exactly what I mean. You're trying to divert the topic by saying people who come to nice places and cause trouble." "I wasn't causing a disturbance. I was just sitting quietly, drinking my coffee," Renee replied. "Not yet," Brener interjected. "You haven't caused a disturbance yet, but we've seen people like you before. You come in all innocent, and then things heat up. We're just trying to prevent problems before they start." Renee's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. Every word, every implication, every prejudiced gesture. She had investigated hundreds of complaints involving these dynamics. She knew this pattern by heart. Create a conflict, escalate the situation through intimidation, and frame the violence as the victim's fault. It was clear the officers wanted to do just that. The difference was that, for the first time in her career, she wasn't just reading about this in a file. Renee was living it. And neither officer realized they were harassing the one person who could end their careers in the building. But they would realize it very soon. But it was already too late. It was already too late. "Look," said Brener, his voice hard, "we can handle this the easy way or the hard way. The choice is yours. But you're not leaving here until we're certain you're not a problem." This was never a warning. They were openly trying to threaten and intimidate her. Renee kept her hands visible on the table, gripping her coffee cup, a conscious choice born of her training and bitter experience. She knew exactly what happened when police claimed they felt threatened by sudden movements. "I'm not a problem, Officer Brener. I'm just a citizen drinking coffee in a public place," she defended herself. "How do you know my name?" Brener asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Your name tag, Renee said, gesturing lightly toward the metal badge on his uniform. You said it had to be visible. Fitch moved even closer. You really are an observer, aren't you? Maybe you're too much of an observer. What are you, some kind of police observer? Are you one of those people who gets a kick out of trying to catch cops while they're doing their jobs? He fired off a barrage of questions. They were trying to figure out who Renee really was, and they were also using this as an excuse to belittle her. The irony was so deep that Renee almost laughed. Instead, she took another measured sip of her coffee and used the moment to scan the room. Most of the customers had already left, not wanting to be near a situation involving aggressive police, but she spotted a burly man at the corner table, Marty Keene, one of the regulars she'd noticed on previous visits, his phone carefully angled toward them. Good. Let that be evidence. Let there be witnesses who can't claim they didn't see what happened later. I'm just someone who knows her rights, Renee said quietly. Rights, Brener sneered, his face flushing slightly. You people are always talking about rights. What about responsibilities? How about showing some respect for officers doing their jobs? He asked sarcastically. I am showing respect, Renee replied. I'm being polite, answering your questions, and not causing any disturbance, she said. But you're not showing your ID, Fitch interjected. That's obstruction of duty. We could arrest you right now for obstruction of duty, he retorted. Renee met his gaze calmly. Refusing to show identification without reasonable suspicion is not obstruction of duty, Officer Fitch. That's established case law. Terry v. Ohio. You need a clearly articulable reasonable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or will commit a crime, she replied. The silence that followed was as sharp as a knife. Brenner's jaw was visibly twitching, his hand moving toward his service weapon. Renee interpreted this not as a genuine threat assessment, but as an intimidation tactic. So you're a lawyer now, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Is that it? Did you come here to set us up, cause a scene, and sue the department? Brenner asked. Renee was acting so professionally and calmly that they couldn't find a single thing to pin on her. Renee was a citizen who knew her rights. Then, I came here to have coffee, Renee continued, her patience wearing thin despite her training. You approached me. Even though I was trying to calm the situation down, you're the ones escalating this interaction, she said. Tessa Ward had stepped back toward their table in the cafe. Her discomfort was evident, but she finally spoke up. Officers, maybe we should all just, she began. But I told you not to get involved in this, Brenner said harshly, without looking at her. This doesn't concern you, he added. Actually, it does concern me, Tessa said, her voice trembling but resolute. This is my cafe, and she's my customer. I defended Renee by saying she didn't do anything wrong. Fitch turned his attention to the waitress, and Renee immediately noticed the tactical shift, dividing his focus, creating multiple pressure points, using intimidation to isolate the target from potential allies. Are you sure about this? Fitch asked, his tone carrying a clear threat. Are you sure you want to interfere with a police investigation? Because this could end badly for you. Health code violations, business license issues, these kinds of things tend to surface when people don't cooperate, he said. He was clearly threatening Tessa with her livelihood. That this was clearly corruption, the regulatory authority being used so casually as a weapon, would have been shocking if Renee hadn't seen it documented in dozens of complaint files. Bad cops worked like this, creating networks of coercion to silence witnesses before they could speak. What investigation? Renee asked, drawing their attention back to herself. What crime are you suspecting me of? She asked. She didn't want Tessa to get hurt. Disturbing the peace, Brener said immediately. Loitering, he listed a string of offenses, claiming I was disobeying lawful orders. Both Renee and the police officers knew this wasn't true. I've been sitting here drinking coffee for 30 minutes. I'm not loitering, I'm not disturbing the peace. And if your orders aren't based on reasonable suspicion, they're not lawful, Renee argued in her defense. Brener reached out and grabbed her wrist before Renee could react. His grip was tight enough to hurt, his fingers dug into the tendons and bones with an experienced precision. What about resisting arrest? Is that legal enough for you? He asked harshly. Renee's training screamed at her to pull away, to defend herself. But she also knew that any physical resistance would be exactly the excuse they were looking for. So she remained still, keeping her voice steady while letting the pain show on her face. You're hurting me, Officer Brener. I want you to let go of my wrist, she warned him. I'll let go when you show your ID, the man said, tightening his grip even further and beginning to cause damage to her wrist. This is an assault, Renee said in a clear voice, raising her voice so everyone in the cafe could hear. You're attacking me because I'm exercising my constitutional rights, she said. Fitch stepped behind her and Renee felt his hand land heavily on her shoulder. He was pressing down hard enough to make her uncomfortable. You're awfully talkative for someone in your position. Maybe you need to learn a little respect. At the other end of the cafe, Marty Keene's phone remained steady, still recording. Tessa stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes wide with fear but refusing to look away. And Renee, with the meticulousness of someone who'd spent years preparing cases, mentally noted every detail: excessive use of force, lack of reasonable suspicion, intimidation of witnesses, abuse of authority. "This is your last chance," Brener said, his face now just a few inches from hers. "ID, now." Renee's mind raced through her options. She could reveal her rank and end this situation immediately. But then she would miss the opportunity to fully document how these officers treated civilians they perceived as powerless. How many others had sat in exactly this position, facing exactly this abuse, without the resources or authority to fight back? "My ID is in my jacket pocket," Renee said carefully. "If you let go of my wrist, I'll get it." Renee's grip loosened slightly, and Renee reached slowly for her jacket with her free hand. Her fingers brushed the leather badge case she always carried. The weight of the captain's badge was palpable even through the fabric. But before she could pull it out, Fitch grabbed her arm. "Stop, let me check what you're reaching for. It could be a gun." His hand stroked her jacket with unnecessary roughness. He was fiddling with it in a way that had nothing to do with safety, but everything to do with defiance. Renee forced herself to stay still, breathe steadily, and not give them the reaction they wanted. "No gun," Fitch said, stepping back with obvious disappointment. "Just a wallet and wait." His hand paused at the badge holder. "What's this?" Before Renee could stop him, he pulled it out of his pocket and held it up in the air, a mix of curiosity and triumph. Then when he opened the case and saw the captain's badge inside, his expression changed. Her face went pale. "Brener, what?" Brener was still gripping Renee's wrist tightly, still standing aggressively close. "Brener, you have to see this." Fitch's voice had gone hollow. Brener snatched the badge holder, and Renee watched as a look of shock, as if she'd been struck in the face, flashed across her face. The badge. The ID card, identifying her as Captain Renee Lawson of the Department of the Interior. This authority proved she wasn't just an ordinary civilian, but someone who had investigated officers just like them. As if suddenly struck by electricity, she pulled her hand away from her wrist. She took a step back. Her previous cool demeanor had transformed into panic, poorly concealed beneath a mask of confusion. "Captain," he said, the word coming out hoarsely. We didn't know." "What didn't you know?" Renee asked quietly, rubbing her wrist where bruises were already beginning to form. "That I'm a police captain? Or that the person you harassed might have the authority to hold you accountable?" Fitch's face had gone pale. His earlier aggression had given way to visible fear. "Ma'am, this was just, we were following procedure." "Procedure?" Renee's voice remained calm, but it had steel in it. "Is demanding ID without reasonable suspicion procedure? Using excessive force when someone exercises their rights? Threatening cafe owners who were trying to help? Conducting illegal searches? You?" Brener began, then stopped. He realized finishing the sentence would only put him in an even worse position. "What did you think I was, Officer Brener? Someone you could intimidate without consequences? Someone whose rights don't matter because of the color of my skin?" The cafe had fallen completely silent. Marty Keene's phone was still recording. Tessa stood behind the counter, her hand over her mouth. And the two officers who had been so aggressive just a few minutes ago now seemed to realize they were dancing on the edge of a cliff. "We're sorry, Captain," said Fitch. "This was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Renee repeated, her tone making it clear exactly what she thought of that description. "Did you misunderstand that I have rights? Did you misunderstand that no matter who you attack, the attack is illegal? Did you misunderstand that your badges don't grant permission to abuse power?" Brenner's hand reached for his radio, and Renee saw a calculation taking place behind his eyes. Reporting the incident, getting ahead of the story, claiming it was all a mistake before Renee could file a complaint. "Don't do it," she said in a sharp voice. "Don't even think about doing anything other than reporting this exactly as it happened. I have witnesses, I have evidence, and I have 14 years of experience in spotting when cops try to cover their tracks." She stood up from her desk, and both officers instinctively took a step back. The balance of power had shifted so completely that, if the situation weren't so serious, it might even have been funny. Renee took her badge from Brenner's limp hand and put it back in her jacket pocket. "Here's what's going to happen. You're leaving this cafe immediately. You'll write accurate reports about this incident. And on Monday morning, you'll come to my office to give your official statement. If you try to lie, if you try to intimidate witnesses, if you do anything other than tell the whole truth, I'll personally make sure you never wear a badge again." "Yes, ma'am," said Brener, his previous confidence completely gone. "There's one more thing," Renee added, her voice taking on a more menacing tone. "How many more citizens have you harassed, intimidated, and attacked because you thought they couldn't fight back?" Neither officer answered, but their silence spoke volumes. "Get out," said Renee, "now." They hurried out, practically fleeing toward the exit as the sound of their boots echoed on the wooden floor. The door closed behind them with a soft click. In the silent cafe, that sound had seemed impossibly loud. Renee paused for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The adrenaline that had kept her voice steady was beginning to fade, giving way to trembling hands and a racing heart. She had maintained a professional composure throughout the encounter, but the toll of that control was now hitting her. Tessa approached cautiously. "Captain, I'm so sorry. I should have done more. I should have called." "You tried." Renee gently cut her off. "And he threatened you for it. It's not your fault." Marty Keene stepped out from the table in the corner, the phone still in his hand. "I recorded everything, from the moment they first approached you until they left. Do you want me to send it to you?" Renee nodded and gave him her official email address. "Thank you. That recording is crucial evidence." "Evidence for what?" Marty asked. "For the investigation I'm launching Monday morning into Brener and Fitch officers' patterns of harassment, excessive use of force, and abuse of authority." Renee scanned the now empty cafe. "For complaints I've suspected existed but were never properly investigated. For the long overdue accountability." She sat back down at her table in the corner. Her untouched coffee had gone cold. The quiet coffee break she'd wanted had turned into something entirely different. A documented example of the kind of abuse she'd fought against throughout her career. But this time, she had the evidence, the authority, and the witnesses to ensure accountability. And officers Brener and Fitch were about to learn that some people could definitely fight back. On Monday morning, the sun streamed through the high windows of the Department of the Interior's offices, illuminating the evidence spread across Renee's desk like an indictment waiting to be filed. Marty Keene's video played on the computer screen for the third time, a recording that clearly documented everything from Brener's initial approach to Fitch's illegal search, from the wrist grip that left visible bruises to their panicked retreat when his rank was revealed. Renee paused the video at a frame where Brener's hand gripped her wrist, the force of his grip causing her knuckles to turn white. She had taken photos of the bruises that Sunday morning, purple and yellow marks spreading across his dark skin, fingerprints that would take weeks to fade. The medical records were complete, witness statements had been taken. The video evidence was secured with a proper chain of custody. Everything was by the book, because she knew the system would look for any excuse to reject it. A knock at the door interrupted his review. Deputy Commander Detective Marcus Webb entered, carrying a thick file with an expression that hinted at bad news. "Captain, you need to see this." He placed the file on his desk. "I pulled up Brener and Fitch's personnel files at your request. The situation is worse than we thought." When Renee opened the file, complaints dating back years came to light: excessive use of force, racial profiling, illegal searches, intimidation of witnesses, page after page of allegations most marked as baseless or insufficient evidence. 17 complaints against Brener over 6 years, Marcus said, pointing to the summary page. 12 against Fitch over 4 years. Not a single valid finding, not even a reprimand letter. Renee clenched her jaw as she read through the cases, each following the same patterns she'd experienced herself. Citizens harassed for no reason, aggressive interrogations escalating to physical force, victims trying to file complaints found themselves facing charges of disturbing the peace or resisting arrest. "Who investigated these?" she asked, though she was certain she already knew the answer. "Sergeant Hines," Marcus confirmed. "For the past 8 years he's handled every complaint filed against officers at his station, and for some reason, he never found any misconduct. Protection schemes masquerading as investigations." Renee had seen this before in other units, other departments, superiors who viewed complaints not as opportunities for accountability, but as threats to their command. Officers who closed ranks to protect their own men without regard for the evidence. "Bring it all out," Renee said. "Every case Hines investigated, every complaint that was dismissed. I want to see how deep this goes." Marcus nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Captain, you should know that rumors about what happened on Friday have already started spreading. Some say you instigated it, that you were looking for an incident to make the department look bad." "Some," Renee repeated. "Let me guess, are Brener and Fitch claiming they were set up?" "Through union representatives. They say you set them up while hiding your identity, that everything was staged to ruin their careers." Renee reopened the video and fast-forwarded to the moment she had called Fitch without his consent and found his badge. "The video shows they conducted an illegal search that exposed my identity against my will. This isn't concealment. This is a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. I know that, you know that. But they're telling everyone listening a different story." Marcus hesitated. "There's talk that they'll file a complaint against you for targeting them." "Of course they would. That's how the system protects itself. It turns the investigator into the investigated, makes accountability look like persecution, and creates so much noise around the victim that the actual abuse gets lost amid conflicting narratives." "Let them file a complaint," Renee said. "Everything I did on Friday was legal. Everything they did was documented. Let them try to explain this to the review board." After Marcus left, Renee spent the next 2 hours reviewing the complaint files with the seasoned eye of someone who had been spotting patterns others missed for years. The cases against Brener and Fitch were not isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic policing approach that views certain communities as inherently suspicious and uses the badge as a license to harass. Was stopped on the grounds that she fit the description, but it turned out that description was impossibly vague. A Latina woman, a third-generation citizen who was questioned about her immigration status. An elderly black couple asked for identification while sitting on a bench in their own neighborhood. Asian American business owners were subjected to repeated health checks that seemed more like a search for violations. Every complaint had been investigated by Sergeant Hines. Despite witness statements and evidence to the contrary, each was dismissed as a communication error or proper police procedure. At 11 a.m. the phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for Deputy Chief Martin Keller's office. "Captain Lawson," Keller's voice was carefully neutral. "You need to come to my office. There's a situation." It turned out the situation was Corporal Hines, sitting across from Keller's desk. His expression was a mix of defensive anger and bureaucratic calculation. He didn't notice Renee's entrance, keeping his eyes fixed on the deputy. "Captain," Keller began, gesturing to an empty chair, "Corporal Hines has conveyed some concerns to me regarding your handling of Friday's incident." "My handling?" Renee stood up. "I was harassed and assaulted by officers under Corporal Hines's command." Hines finally looked at her, and Renee saw that cold, calculating gaze born of years spent protecting bad cops. "With all due respect, Captain, that's an interpretation. But Officers Brener and Fitch are telling a different story. They say you acted suspiciously, refused lawful orders, and became aggressive when they tried to conduct an ID check. I was drinking coffee at a cafe. I refused the request to show ID because they had no reasonable suspicion. And their orders weren't lawful. They had no reasonable grounds to demand my ID or conduct a search. They say you were acting suspiciously," Hines replied. "They say you matched the description of someone involved in recent thefts in the area." "What description?" Renee pulled out her tablet and accessed the incident reports from Friday. No theft reports were filed near Harbor Cafe. No wanted alerts. There's no justification for them approaching you. Keller raised his hand. "Ladies, let's be professional. Sergeant Hines, are you saying this should be handled internally rather than through a formal misconduct case?" "Exactly," said Hines, leaning forward. "These are good officers who made an innocent mistake. They didn't recognize Captain Lawson in civilian clothes. Once they realized who he was, they immediately apologized and left. No harm done." "No harm done?" Renee raised her wrist. The bruises were still clearly visible. "I've documented my injuries resulting from excessive force. I have video evidence of harassment, unlawful searches, and intimidation of witnesses. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern of misconduct directed at someone with the authority to hold them accountable." "A pattern?" Hines's voice hardened. "Captain, I've reviewed the allegations you've raised. These officers have clean records. They have 17 and 12 complaints, respectively," Renee corrected. "All of them were dismissed without a proper investigation on your part." "They were all found to be baseless," Hines replied. "Because these were baseless claims made by people trying to avoid legitimate disciplinary action." Renee turned to Keller. "Sir, I am requesting that a formal misconduct investigation be opened against Officers Brener and Fitch. Additionally, I am requesting an independent review of all complaint investigations conducted by Sergeant Hines over the past 8 years. The pattern of dismissals indicates a systematic failure to hold officers accountable." Keller's expression showed that he had hoped to avoid precisely this kind of escalation. "Captain, this is a significant request. You're talking about reviewing hundreds of cases. I'm talking about doing the job this department was created to do." Renee cut him off. "Internal Affairs investigates misconduct. We're not covering this up to protect the department's image." "No one is covering anything up," Hines said in a cold tone. "What I'm doing is preventing a witch hunt based on an officer's revenge against the patrol." "Revenge?" Renee's voice remained calm, but there was a clear edge to it. "I was sitting in a cafe minding my own business when 2 officers decided to harass me just because of my appearance. That's not revenge. That's a documented human rights violation." The office fell silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sounds of daytime activity in the building. Keller scanned the 2 women as he tried to find a way to minimize the damage to the department. "Here's what will happen," he said finally. "Captain Lawson will conduct an official investigation into Friday's incident. Corporal Hines will cooperate fully by providing all relevant documents. Officers Brener and Fitch will be placed on administrative duty until the investigation is concluded." "Administrative duty?" Hines objected. "Sir, that essentially means suspending them based on unproven allegations." "Based on video evidence and witness statements," Keller corrected him. "Captain Lawson will review these in accordance with standard procedures. If no misconduct is found during the investigation, they will return to their full duties without disciplinary action. If misconduct is found, appropriate consequences will follow." He turned to Renee. "As for reviewing Corporal Hines's previous investigations, the Chief's approval is required for that. I'll schedule a meeting by the end of the week. In the meantime, focus on the current case." This wasn't everything Renee had wanted, but it was enough to start with. She nodded. "Understood, sir." After leaving Keller's office, Renee returned to her desk to find Marcus waiting with another stack of files. "Body camera footage from Friday," he said. "It's claimed that Brener and Fitch's cameras were malfunctioning. What a coincidence." Renee opened the file and reviewed the technical reports. Both officers' cameras had functioned flawlessly throughout their shifts until they entered Harbor Cafe. Then both devices experienced a spontaneous malfunction and no footage of the incident remained. "They turned them off," Renee said. "It wasn't a question." "It seems so. But without a witness to confirm the cameras were intentionally turned off, it's hard to prove it was equipment failure." Renee jotted a note in the case file. "Intentionally disabling body cameras to prevent the documentation of misconduct, another violation to add to the ever-growing list." It was becoming impossible to ignore this pattern. Officers who knew they were breaking the rules and were taking active steps to hide the evidence of their actions. Her phone vibrated with a message from Tessa Ward, a waitress at the Harbor Cafe. "Captain, someone came to the cafe asking questions about Friday. He said he was from the police union. He wanted to know if I'd give a statement supporting the officers. I said no, but I thought you should know. Witness intimidation." Renee forwarded the message to Marcus and asked him to document it as part of the investigation. Even before official proceedings had begun, attempts to obstruct accountability were escalating. That afternoon, news spread throughout the department that Captain Lawson was investigating 2 patrol officers for misconduct. Reactions were predictably divided. Reform-minded officers offered quiet support, while old-school patrol officers viewed it as an attack on their authority, and the command calculated the political consequences with concern. Renee received 3 anonymous emails suggesting she should drop the matter for the department's sake. 2 voicemails from union representatives requesting a meeting to discuss the situation, and a handwritten note slipped under her office door, bearing only the words, "Some investigations can backfire on the investigator." She kept everything as evidence of a pressure campaign designed to make an official inquiry prohibitively costly. At 5 o'clock, as the golden afternoon light painted the office windows, Marcus knocked on the door again. "I found something interesting," he said, opening a file on his tablet. "Do you remember how Brener and Fitch claimed the suspect matched the description? I checked with headquarters. No such call ever came in. No description was broadcast. There were no reports of theft in that area last week, so they made up an excuse after the fact," said Renee, taking notes. "It's worse than that. I spoke off the record with some patrol officers. Apparently, Brener and Fitch have made a habit of stopping people at their cafes and restaurants. They see it as maintaining order, keeping certain people away from certain places." Renee suddenly looked up. "How many more people have they done this to?" "It's hard to say. But I found 6 complaints over the past 3 years with similar patterns. Black or brown citizens drinking coffee or eating alone in predominantly white establishments. Brener and Fitch approach them, demand ID for no reason, and resort to force when people stand up for their rights. All 6 complaints were dismissed by Sergeant Hines on the grounds that they were baseless. Bring me those case files." And Marcus, reach out to the complainants. Tell them that the Department of the Interior has reopened their cases with a proper investigation. Find out if they're willing to give statements. As Marcus left to carry out the orders, Renee stood at her window, watching the sun paint the city in warm hues. Somewhere out there, Brener and Fitch were probably telling themselves this would blow over, that their union would protect them. A single captain, wounded and armed with video evidence, couldn't overpower the institutional machinery designed to shield officers from the consequences. They were about to find out just how wrong they were, because Renee Lawson hadn't spent 14 years fighting corruption from the inside only to turn a blind eye when she became the target. She had the evidence, the witnesses, and the documentation of a scheme spanning years. And most importantly, she had the authority to ensure accountability, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been harassed by officers who believed their badges granted them immunity. The investigation was just beginning, but the outcome was already starting to become clear. Officers Brener and Fitch had picked the wrong person to abuse their power against, and now they would pay the price. 2 weeks after the Harbor Cafe incident, the morning sun was illuminating the conference room on the 3rd floor. Renee had gathered the evidence here, which now covered 3 walls. Photos of the bruises, transcripts of witness interviews, body camera malfunction reports, and a timeline showing that complaints dating back 8 years had been systematically dismissed. Marcus Webb stood beside her, reviewing the 6 previous victims who had agreed to testify under oath. Sarah Chen was stopped in front of Wang's restaurant in 2023. Michael Rodriguez was harassed at Bailey's Cafe in 2022. Deshaun Williams, Marcus Thompson, Keisha Davis, and Linda Okonkwo, all between 2021 and 2024. They all follow the same pattern: black or brown citizens drinking coffee or eating alone in predominantly white establishments. Brener and Fitch demanding identification without cause, and the situation escalating into violence when their rights were asserted. And all 6 complaints were dismissed by Sergeant Hines on the grounds that they were baseless. Renee added, producing investigation reports that contained identical phrasing despite involving different victims and circumstances. The copy-and-paste nature of the dismissal decisions was clear proof that a superficial review had been conducted instead of a thorough investigation. Her phone vibrated. A message from her assistant. The union attorney for officers Brener and Fitch is here. He's requesting a meeting. Renee checked her watch. 09:47. The official deposition wasn't scheduled until 1 p.m., but the union clearly wanted to present its own account first. Tell them I'll meet with them at 10. Conference room B. At exactly 10, when Renee entered conference room B, she found union attorney Gerald Vance standing alongside officers Brener and Fitch, both in their official uniforms, projecting an image of professional authority that contradicted everything the evidence indicated. Captain Lawson, Vance began before Renee had even sat down. My clients are the victims here. Victims of a setup, a coordinated effort to damage their reputations, and an investigation driven by a desire for personal revenge rather than professional duty. Renee settled into her chair and placed her tablet on the table between them. Your clients attacked a colleague, conducted illegal searches, intimidated witnesses, and intentionally disabled body cameras to conceal evidence. These aren't allegations, they're documented facts. Documented by whom? Vance leaned forward. By you, that is, by the so-called victim who is also the investigator. This is a clear conflict of interest that taints the entire process. The investigation is being conducted in accordance with department protocol. Renee replied calmly. I am the assigned internal affairs captain. The fact that I am a victim does not negate my authority to investigate the misconduct. Brener shifted in his chair. His previous nonchalant demeanor had given way to barely concealed hostility. You set a trap for us. You went to that cafe in civilian clothes, concealed your identity, and provoked us into an interaction so you could make a harassment claim. I went to the cafe to drink coffee, said Renee. You approached me without cause, demanded my ID without reasonable suspicion, used physical force when I exercised my constitutional rights, and only stopped once you learned my rank. Video evidence supports every stage of these events. Probably a video recorded by a cafe customer who was working with you, Fitch muttered. Renee opened Marty Keene's statement on her tablet. Mr. Keene is a regular at Harbor Cafe and has no connection to me or the department. He recorded it because he noticed the harassment he witnessed, just as the other 6 victims noticed the same pattern when you did the same thing to them. Vance's face tensed. You're basing this investigation on complaints that were previously investigated and found to be baseless. Complaints dismissed by Sergeant Hines without a proper investigation, Renee corrected. I reviewed his case files. The same statements were used in multiple incidents. Witnesses weren't followed up with. Existing evidence wasn't examined. Investigation steps weren't documented. This isn't an investigation, it's a cover-up. This is a serious accusation against a decorated sergeant, Vance warned. This is a fact-based observation supported by his own reports. Renee displayed side-by-side comparisons on the screen showing complaints dismissed using the copy-paste method. Corporal Hines concluded that every complaint was baseless without interviewing witnesses or examining evidence, relying solely on officers' statements. This violates department policy and basic investigative standards. Brener's hands clenched on the table. So what? Are you going after Hines now too? Is this going to keep expanding until everyone who doesn't bow to your agenda is gone? My agenda is accountability, Renee said calmly. Officers who abuse their authority will face the consequences. Superiors who cover up misconduct face the consequences. This isn't revenge, it's the very reason the Department of Internal Affairs exists. Well, who holds you accountable? Vance asked. Who oversees the investigation when the investigator has personal motivations? Deputy Commissioner Keller oversees all Department of Internal Affairs investigations, Renee replied. He reviewed my file and approved the continuation of the formal charges. If you believe there is bias, file a complaint through the proper channels. However, this investigation will proceed based on evidence, not the union's pressure tactics. The meeting devolved into procedural debates that led nowhere and ended with Vance threatening to file a complaint with the chief and the Civilian Oversight Board. Renee allowed him to make his threats. Every objection would be documented, and none would alter the fundamental facts recorded on video and corroborated by witnesses. Official depositions began at 1 p.m. First up was Sarah Chen, the company attorney, who, while recounting how Brener and Fitch approached her outside Wong's restaurant in 2023, Sarah Chen, the company's attorney, whose composure could not fully conceal her lasting trauma. I had just finished dinner with my colleagues, Sarah said. Her statement was being recorded by the court clerk. I was waiting for the car that would pick me up when they arrived. They asked what I was doing in this neighborhood and said I looked suspicious while standing on the sidewalk. Did they clearly state the reason for their suspicion? Renee asked. No. They asked for ID and said I matched a description. When I asked which description, Officer Brener became aggressive. He said I wasn't cooperating. Sarah's hands gripped the water glass tightly. I showed them my ID and business card, which proved I was at the restaurant for a business lunch. Still, they detained me for 20 minutes and searched my bag without my consent. Did you file a complaint? Yes. I documented everything and submitted witness statements from my colleagues who saw the incident. The investigator, Sergeant Hines, met with me once, then told me the officer's actions were justified based on suspicious behavior he never defined. The case was closed. Marcus guided Sarah through the rest of her statement and highlighted a pattern repeated in all 6 previous victims' cases: unwarranted stops, demands for ID without cause, searches without consent or reasonable cause, and Hines's dismissal of complaints without conducting a proper investigation. Next, Michael Rodriguez testified and described being harassed at Bailey's Cafe in 2022. I was drinking coffee and working on my laptop. They came in and immediately focused on me. They asked what I was doing there and said the cafe had reported suspicious activity. The cafe owner later told me no such report had been made. Deshaun Williams described being stopped in front of a coffee shop. Keisha Davis described being harassed at a lunch restaurant. Marcus Thompson gave a detailed account of being interrogated while waiting for a friend at a restaurant. Linda Okonkwo stated that she was detained while having breakfast alone. Every story followed the same pattern. Brener and Fitch would approach without cause, demand compliance based on fabricated suspicions, resort to violence when citizens asserted their rights, and then Hines would dismiss the inevitable complaints as baseless. By late afternoon, this pattern had become undeniable. This was not an isolated incident of abuse, it was a systematic targeting of minorities in predominantly white areas, supported by a supervisor who viewed complaints not as a mechanism for accountability, but as a threat. At 4 p.m., Renee's phone rang. Deputy Chief Keller's voice was tense. "Captain, there's an issue. The police union just held a press conference. They're accusing you of waging a witch hunt against patrol officers." Renee opened the live stream on her computer. Union President Frank Malloy stood on a podium outside the main building, flanked by Brener and Fitch in full uniform. "Captain Renee Lawson is waging a vendetta against good officers who made an innocent mistake," said Malloy. His voice carried the practiced anger of someone skilled at manipulating public opinion. "She set these officers up, disguised her identity to provoke an incident, and is now using her position to ruin their careers based not on facts but on her personal anger." Behind him, as Brener and Fitch maintained an expression of wounded pride, Malloy continued to recount the story of the victimized officers who had become the target of an overzealous investigator with an agenda. "This kind of abuse of authority makes it impossible for officers to do their jobs," said Malloy. "When police officers can't even ask questions without fear of being investigated by someone harboring a grudge, public safety suffers. We demand an independent review of Captain Lawson's investigation and his recusal from this case due to a clear conflict of interest." Renee watched the spectacle with the detached analysis of someone who had seen this scenario before. Portray the investigator as biased, present accountability as persecution. Depict the system protecting bad cops as if it were the victim of an unfair inquiry. Her phone was buzzing with calls from journalists seeking comment. She ignored them, instead opening the evidence files and preparing an official response through proper channels rather than engaging in a media spectacle. By evening, the press conference had fully captured the attention the union had sought. News outlets had framed the incident as officers caught on video harassing the captain, but as controversial investigation divides department. Social media was flooded with conflicting accounts. Some supported Renee's investigation, while others accepted the union's narrative of a trap and revenge. But while the union controlled the narrative, Renee controlled the evidence. And the evidence didn't care about narratives. The next morning, she presented her official findings to Deputy Chief Keller. Officers Brener and Fitch had engaged in acts of harassment, excessive use of force, unlawful searches, witness intimidation, and the deliberate destruction of evidence by disabling body cameras. Sergeant Hines had systematically failed to properly investigate complaints, violated department policy, and had paved the way for an 8-year cycle of abuse. Recommended disciplinary actions: dismissal for Brener and Fitch, demotion and suspension for Hines, and mandatory retraining for all station personnel on civil rights and proper complaint investigation procedures. Keller summoned him to his office that afternoon, bright sunlight streaming through the windows offering a view of the city. "Captain, these recommendations spell the end of their careers. Are you certain the evidence supports them? I have video recordings of the assault and harassment. There are 6 victims whose testimonies corroborate the accounts. There are body camera reports proving the recordings were intentionally shut off. There are Sergeant Hines' own files showing he systematically failed to conduct investigations. The evidence doesn't just support these recommendations, it mandates them. Keller examined the file with a worried expression on his face. The union will vehemently oppose this. They'll challenge every finding, dragging this out through grievance procedures for months, maybe years. Let them, said Renee. Every appeal will force them to address the evidence. Every grievance hearing will document their misconduct. The longer they fight, the clearer this pattern will become. What about the department's reputation? Holding officers accountable rather than covering up their misconduct will do more good for our reputation. We can weather the negative publicity from disciplining bad cops, but we can't weather being exposed as an institution that covers up misconduct. Keller was silent for a long time, then nodded. I'll pass your suggestions on to the chief. The disciplinary hearing is scheduled for next month. Be prepared. The union will lay everything out on the table. As Renee was leaving her office, Marcus stopped her with the news. Captain, 2 more victims have come forward. They saw the news reports and recognized Brener and Fitch from their own experiences. Similar patterns, both complaints were dismissed by Hines. There were now 8 victims, 8 documented cases involving the same officers, using the same tactics, targeting the same demographic group, all covered up by the same supervisor. The pattern had shifted from persuasive to overwhelming. That evening, as the golden glow of sunset illuminated her office, Renee received an email from Sarah Chen. Watching the press conference made me angry all over again. But knowing that you're actually holding them accountable makes me feel like my complaint finally means something. Thank you for not letting them sweep this under the rug. Similar messages came from other victims, people fighting back but rejected by a system designed to protect the police rather than hold them accountable. Their gratitude was deep, yet it also highlighted the core issue. Accountability should not have required a victim who was also a police captain with the authority and resources to push the issue. How many other victims had endured the same harassment but lacked the power to see it through? How many complaints had vanished due to Hines' systematic rejection? How many officers were still operating under the assumption that their badges meant impunity? Renee added the new victim statements to the evidence file and watched the case grow stronger with each addition. The union could fabricate stories. They could accuse her of seeking revenge. They could portray accountability as oppression. But the truth captured on video, documented in sworn statements, and preserved in evidence that would withstand any honest scrutiny, could not be altered. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for 4 weeks later. This gave the union time to prepare its defense, coordinate its strategy, pressure witnesses, and manipulate perceptions. This also gave Renee time to prepare a case so comprehensive that the union's pressure couldn't overcome it. Officers Brener and Fitch believed themselves to be untouchable. Sergeant Hines had built his career by protecting bad cops. The union assumed that the institutional machinery would turn this investigation into procedural delays and ultimately lead to the case being dismissed. They were all about to learn that some responsibilities cannot be covered up, some evidence cannot be dismissed, and some investigators cannot be intimidated into silence. The fight was not yet over, but the outcome was beginning to take shape. And for the 8 victims whose complaints had been dismissed as trivial, justice was finally within reach. 4 weeks later, when the Civil Review Board convened to rule on the charges of misconduct against officers Brener and Fitch, the bright morning sun streamed through the high windows, illuminating the department's hearing room. Renee sat at the prosecution table alongside Marcus. The evidence was organized into folders documenting every element of the systematic harassment that had spanned 8 years and affected 8 victims. Across the corridor, Union Attorney Gerald Vance had gathered his team. Brener and Fitch stood beside him in their ceremonial uniforms. Behind them sat Corporal Hines, accused of suppressing complaints and failing to properly investigate documented instances of misconduct. Board Chairman Thomas Weiland opened the hearing at exactly 9 o'clock. This board has reviewed the preliminary materials submitted by both sides. We will now hear the formal presentation of evidence, beginning with the Department of the Interior. Renee stood up and uploaded the first piece of evidence to the screens in the hearing room. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, the evidence will demonstrate that officers Brener and Fitch engaged in a systematic pattern of harassment targeting minorities in predominantly white settings. This pattern was enabled by Sergeant Hines, who created an environment where officers believed their misconduct would have no consequences by dismissing legitimate complaints without conducting proper investigations. She moved to the next slide, a video from Marty Keene at Harbor Cafe, with the timestamp clearly visible. Around 4:47 p.m. on October 15th, I was sitting at Harbor Cafe having coffee after work. Officers Brener and Fitch entered and approached me immediately, without any reasonable cause or suspicion. The video played in crystal clear clarity. The board watched as Brener's aggressive approach, Fitch's coordinated stance, and the escalating demands for identification despite Renee calmly asserting her rights, unfolded. The audio recording had captured every word, every implication, every veiled threat. When the video reached the moment Brener grabbed Renee's wrist, Board member Patricia Chen leaned forward, her expression hardening. It was clear from the screen that an amount of force sufficient to leave a bruise was being applied despite Renee's controlled reaction. It was obvious she was in pain. Then came the illegal search. Fitch's hands searched Renee's jacket, finding her badge wallet. This moment was a realization that shattered their previous confidence. The video tells the whole story, Renee said as the footage ended. But this wasn't an isolated incident. It was the latest example of the same pattern of harassment directed at 8 different victims over the course of 8 years: Sarah Chen, Michael Rodriguez, Deshaun Williams, Marcus Thompson, Keisha Davis, Linda Okonkwo, and the 2 latest additions, James Patterson and Maria Gonzalez. Each of these citizens filed a complaint against officers Brener and Fitch for unwarranted harassment. Each complaint was dismissed by Sergeant Hines as baseless, without a proper investigation. Marcus took the floor, and with the meticulousness of a prosecutor, outlined each case to the board one by one, revealing an overwhelming pattern. The complaint files contained identical language in their reasons for dismissal. Witness statements had never been heard. The evidence had never been examined. During each incident, the body cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned. In 6 out of 8 cases, Marcus explained, officers claimed their body cameras experienced technical malfunctions precisely at the moment they made contact with citizens. The department's technical services found no evidence of an actual malfunction. The cameras had been manually turned off. He produced the technical reports. The timestamps showed that the cameras had been turned off just before the officers entered the premises and turned back on after they left. Intentional destruction of evidence, documented in their own equipment logs. By lunchtime, when the panel took a lunch break, the evidence presented was already damning, but Vance had his own strategy prepared. When the hearing resumed at 1 p.m., he called his first witness. This witness was a community leader who praised Brener's volunteer work in youth sports programs. Then another witness who described Fitch's participation in charitable events. A series of testimonies about how good officers they were, how dedicated they were to their service, and how this investigation had ruined careers built on noble intentions. Renee listened patiently, recognizing the tactic, burying the misconduct under positive traits, implying that a single incident shouldn't define an entire career, appealing to sympathy rather than upholding the board's standards. But when Vance called Brener to testify, the carefully crafted narrative began to unravel. Officer Brener, Vance began, tell us what happened at Harbor Cafe, from your perspective. Brener cleared his throat. The 4-week-long presentation of evidence had shaken his earlier confidence. We entered the cafe during a routine patrol. We noticed a woman sitting alone who seemed out of place. As part of our community policing duties, we approached her to make sure everything was in order. Out of place, repeated board member Chen. What made her out of place? Brener hesitated when he realized the trap. She was alone. She was wearing civilian clothes. That seemed unusual. Is it unusual for a woman to be drinking coffee alone in a cafe? Chen's voice sharpened. For her demographic group, Brener stammered. There were issues in the neighborhood. What kind, Officer Brener? Renee interjected. What specific criminal activity in that neighborhood justified you approaching me without cause? Brenner's face flushed. There were reports of theft. No, there weren't, Marcus interjected, reviewing the dispatch logs. No reports of theft within a 5-mile radius of Harbor Cafe for the entire week leading up to October 15. You made up that excuse after the fact. The courtroom fell silent, save for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Brener, caught in a lie that brought his entire defense crashing down, froze. Vance tried to salvage the situation. Officer, you initially said you didn't recognize Captain Lawson. What happened after you learned his identity? We apologized and left, said Brener. We made a good faith mistake and tried to correct it. Renee reopened the video and played the segment showing the officers retreating in panic. Is that what apologizing means to you? Backing off without acknowledging the assault, the illegal search, or the harassment that came before. We were taken aback, Brener mumbled. You didn't expect your victim to have the authority to hold you accountable, Renee finished. That's the problem, Officer Brener. You've gotten away with this behavior for years because Sergeant Hines has been dismissing every complaint without investigating. You thought your badge meant you could target people without facing the consequences. When Fitch took the witness stand, his testimony fell apart just as the evidence had already dismantled his claims. He insisted the searches were conducted with consent. However, the video showed that consent was neither requested nor given. He claimed the body cameras had malfunctioned naturally. However, technical reports proved they had been manually disabled. He suggested the previous 8 victims had coordinated false accusations, but their statements were too detailed and consistent to have been fabricated, and most were unaware of one another until Renee's investigation linked them together. By late afternoon, Vance's defense had been reduced to seeking leniency based on his long tenure, rather than denying the actual crime. These officers made mistakes, he admitted, but termination is too severe. Suspension and retraining would serve justice while preserving their careers. As the golden afternoon sun illuminated the courtroom, Renee stood to deliver her closing statement. Your Honor, members of the panel, this is not about the mistakes. Mistakes happen by accident. This was the deliberate, systematic targeting of citizens based on race. It occurred with the support of a supervisor who covered up complaints to protect their command rather than serve justice. She gestured toward the 8 victims present at the hearing, sitting side by side in silent solidarity. These people exercised their constitutional rights and were punished for it. They filed complaints and were rejected. They trusted the system to hold officials accountable and were let down. If we do not remove Officers Brener and Fitch from duty, and if we do not hold Corporal Hines accountable for enabling this behavior, we will be sending the message that badges grant immunity and that the victims do not matter. The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned at 6 p.m., Chairman Weiland's face was grave. The evidence presented is overwhelming and deeply disturbing. This board has determined that Officers Wade Brener and Cole Fitch engaged in harassment, excessive use of force, unlawful search, witness intimidation, and intentional destruction of evidence. These actions have violated department policy, constitutional rights, and public trust. Officers Brener and Fitch have been immediately suspended. Brener's face went pale. Fitch slumped into his chair. Vance immediately began preparing the appeal documents, but the board's findings were clear and supported by irrefutable evidence. As for Sergeant Hines, Weiland continued, the board has determined that systematic failure to properly investigate complaints, violations of investigative protocols, and inadequate oversight allowed for misconduct. Sergeant Hines has been demoted to patrol officer and suspended without pay for 6 months. Upon his return, he will be assigned to the Community Relations Unit, where his failures in oversight can be closely monitored. Hines showed no reaction, but Renee saw him clenching his hands on the table. A career built on protecting bad cops had collapsed under the weight of documented negligence. Finally, said Weiland, turning to Renee, this board commends Captain Lawson for professionally conducting an investigation that required him to be both victim and investigator. His adherence to proper procedure despite personal involvement demonstrates the integrity the Department of the Interior must uphold. The findings have been fully accepted. When the hearing concluded, reporters flooded into the hallway outside. Renee made a brief statement. Today's outcome shows that no officer is above accountability. Badges grant authority, not immunity. When officers abuse that authority, there must be consequences. 8 victims later gathered in a conference room reserved by Renee. Sarah Chen spoke on behalf of the group. For years we were told our complaints didn't matter. We were called overly sensitive or accused of lying. Today it has been proven that we were telling the truth from the start. Thank you for not letting them sweep this under the rug. You made this possible, Renee replied. Your willingness to speak out despite years of rejection, your courage to raise your voices when the system let you down, that's what made accountability possible. I only had the authority to ensure the system listened to you. In the weeks that followed, the layoffs stood up against the union's objections. The arbitrators reviewed the same evidence the board had seen and reached the same conclusions. It was too systematic and well documented to be excused as misconduct, error, or procedural error. The department implemented the reforms Renee proposed. Mandatory body camera use with severe penalties for deactivation, independent civilian oversight of all excessive force complaints, transparent tracking of complaint investigations, and annual audits of supervisors' termination rates to identify patterns, as Hines had noted. Mayor Walsh announced the changes at a press conference held in the City Hall's atrium. These reforms ensure that complaints are thoroughly investigated rather than dismissed to protect the department's image. We are committed to accountability that serves the community, not to covering up misconduct. 3 months after the Harbor Cafe incident, on a bright Friday afternoon as the winter sun streamed through the high windows, Renee returned to the cafe where it all began. Tessa Ward looked up from behind the counter as she prepared orders, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. Captain, or should I say commander. The promotion had come the previous week. She was now the commander of the newly expanded Accountability and Reform Division, with the authority to investigate patterns across the entire department. Just Renee, she said, settling into the corner table where Brener had once cornered her. The place felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the memory of the harassment had been transformed into documented accountability. Tessa brought a fresh cup of coffee without being asked and placed it in front of Renee with a smile. On the house, for making this a safe place again. The cafe was filled with the usual Friday crowd, people working on their laptops, friends chatting over lunch, regulars who knew each other's stories. Ordinary people living their ordinary lives in a place where they no longer had to worry about police using their badges as weapons. Marty Keene came over to Renee's table and sat down in the chair across from her. Captain, I'm glad you're back. Thanks again for that video, said Renee. None of this would have been possible without your evidence. Marty shrugged, but his expression was serious. I couldn't let that slide. It won't happen again. He paused for a moment, then added, my daughter is black. I worry about what might happen whenever she goes out and encounters police like Brener and Fitch. Knowing they're no longer among us makes me feel she's a little safer. At the other end of the cafe, a young black woman sat alone with her laptop and coffee, completely at ease in her solitude. No one approached her to ask why she was there. No one asked for her ID or implied she didn't belong. She was, just as she should be, an ordinary customer enjoying the afternoon. Renee's phone vibrated with an email from Sarah Chen. I just saw the news about your promotion. You deserve it. The reforms you've implemented are important for everyone who's filed a complaint and been turned down. Thank you for proving that the system can work when honest people are in charge. Similar messages had come from the other 7 victims, people who had believed for years that their complaints were worthless, but who finally saw systematic changes implemented because someone had listened to them. A television mounted on the cafe wall was broadcasting the afternoon news with the sound muted, showing footage from the department reform announcement. Subtitles scrolled over images of new complaint tracking systems, expanded civilian oversight, and body camera accountability measures. Tessa gestured toward the screen from behind the counter. Look at this, you're making real change happen. It's not just me, Renee replied. Everyone who speaks out. Everyone who refuses to stay silent. Everyone demanding something better from the system. Change doesn't come from a single hero. It comes from collectively refusing to accept injustice as normal. Movement at the cafe's entrance caught her attention. 2 uniformed officers entered. They were new faces, younger, with body cameras clearly active and recording. They approached the counter professionally, politely ordered coffee, and left after a friendly chat with Tessa. There was no harassment, no intimidation, no assumption that their badges granted them the authority to question citizens without cause. The contrast with Brener and Fitch's entrance was sharp and deliberate. The reforms were working, transforming the culture with every interaction. As the afternoon sun bathed the cafe in warm hues, Renee reflected on her journey from victim to investigator, and from there to reformer. The fingerprint on her wrist had faded months ago, leaving no visible mark, yet its impact continued to ripple through the department, reshaping policies and protecting citizens who would never know of the struggle fought on their behalf. Her phone rang. The caller was Deputy Chief Keller, who in his new command position, was now her direct superior. Commander, there's a case you need to look into. Repeated complaints regarding officers at the 3rd Precinct. There are numerous allegations of excessive force during traffic stops, all of which were dismissed by the same supervisor without a proper investigation. Renee smiled slightly when she heard the echoes of the Brener and Fitch case in his statement. Send the files. I'll start reviewing them Monday morning. I've already sent them. Commander, you've done a good job with the reforms. They're making a difference. As the conversation ended, Renee took a slow sip of her coffee, feeling the weight of her new position and the responsibilities it brought. There would always be more cases, more bad cops who believed badges meant immunity, and more superiors who protected abuse instead of investigating it. But there would also be more victims finding the courage to speak up, more witnesses documenting the abuse, and more reformers demanding accountability. The system that had protected Brener and Fitch for years had finally collapsed, not just because of Renee, but because enough people refused to accept that harassment was normal, or that complaints were worthless. Tessa refilled Renee's coffee without being asked, then paused. You know what I realized? After everything that's happened here, I'm no longer afraid to speak up about problems. If I see something wrong, I'll report it. Because you proved that speaking up really does matter. That was the real victory. Not just firing 2 bad cops or reforming complaint procedures, but transforming a culture where silence meant survival into one where speaking up was possible. The young black woman across from the cafe packed up her laptop and left. Neither the police nor anyone else questioning her right to be there bothered her. The officers who had entered earlier paid their bills politely and left without incident. The cafe continued its normal Friday routine. There was nothing remarkable about it except for what it represented: a reclaimed space, a broken mold, a system forced to choose accountability over the protection of bad behavior. Renee took another sip of her coffee, watching the winter afternoon light cast familiar patterns across the wooden tables. This corner table had witnessed harassment, an attack, and the beginning of an investigation that transformed careers and policies. Now it was simply a cafe table where anyone could sit without fear of being questioned just for existing. And that quiet normality, the ordinary freedom to drink coffee in peace, had been worth every hourly investigation, every union attack, every attempt to portray accountability as revenge. Officers Brener and Fitch had believed themselves untouchable. Sergeant Hines had built his career by protecting them. The union had assumed the institutional machinery would reduce justice to procedural dust. They were all wrong. Because some responsibilities cannot be buried, some patterns cannot be ignored, and some investigators cannot be silenced. Renee Lawson had turned personal harassment into systemic reform, an individual attack into policy change, and a woman's refusal to remain silent into the protection of countless citizens whose names she would never know. The struggle continued. It would always continue as long as power sought to protect itself by sacrificing justice. But the tide had turned. The mechanism that once shielded abuses was now enforcing accountability, and the 8 victims who had been told their complaints were trivial had finally received this response from the system. You were right, your voices were heard, and you matter. As the afternoon light continued to warm the cafe, Renee finished her coffee, stood up, and was about to leave. Tessa waved goodbye with a smile that reflected a gratitude too great for words, and waved goodbye. Marty nodded respectfully from his table. And the venue where the harassment had occurred was now filled with the hum of ordinary life, people working, talking, going about their lives as if nothing had happened. Renee stepped out into the bright afternoon air. Her phone already displayed new case files requiring investigation, new patterns demanding accountability, and new challenges that would test the reform she had helped implement. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had achieved. Delayed justice was not denied justice, at least not as long as the investigators didn't give up. The postponement of accountability did not mean the denial of accountability if the victims refused to remain silent, and the badges used as weapons were turning back into shields, protecting everyone equally, regardless of race or assumptions about where one belonged. The work continued, but the victory was real, and that was enough.